crying out to Hashem. So the question is, why does it say Mal Talmud Lemar Lemor? Why does it really need then to say Lemor? If it says Elna, that would be the request. There was 2 words beforehand, so then we don't need Lemor. It says Hashiveni imata. So what does Rashi say there? Hashiveni imata meraper imlav. It's Moshe says to Hashem to tell him, and he says, answer me whether or not you will heal her. In other words, he says that basically Moshe is telling Hashem, no, regardless, you should answer me. So the question is, Rashi continues. It says Ashe Shivo, and it continues. That's what the Zera Shimshon quotes. Ad kan Lashon. The same kind of wording is quoted in the Yalkut Shimoni, in the same name of the Sifri, and it says Va'olam Makshim, and everyone asks. He said, why does Rashi reverse the order of the explaining? Rashi should have started by saying the words limor. The word, if you look in the Rashi, the Chumash, the first words, the first elna is first in the order of which Rashi gives us pirush, and then limor is second. Not the way that we would think is Rashi would give it, which is limor first, and then elna, because that's the way the order of the pasuk. So everyone asks the same question. It says first, and only afterwards. So the question is why? We have explanation. First, the Zera Shimshon gives 3 approaches. We'll cover all 3 of them, and each one of them has their own unique style and their own unique answer and approach to what we're saying, to what this whole pasuk is all about. Let's first look at the way the pasuk is read. The way the first part of the whole pasuk, it says, is the pshat le. The Zera Shimshon starts by saying the mitchila kasher reisha dekra sefa. He says the beginning of the verse seems to contradict the end of the verse. The pshat the krahu, for the plain meaning of the elna at the end of the verse is in fact not please God, but rather God now. Right, when we know it's milah now ratzalomar miyad v'shazo. V'shana Moshe, accordingly Moshe basically repeated himself. In other words, he said el na refana. He's saying is na to lilmar shtei pamim na. El na refana la kadesha kadosh baruch hu yasem yad bakashato. So what he's saying is that the first el na refana la is basically Moshe's version of saying is Hashem, I need her to be healed right now. Kedamrin ba'alma. The power of this kind of intensified is similar to what we say somewhere else. Shana alava katuv la'akev. So he said the first word or a law to signify how important it is, and we see that or a word or a halacha is repeated. It's to give it the emphasis. And we also learn somewhere else, which is where that when someone who really exerts his energy and learning and teaching is guaranteed that his tefillah will not return empty-handed. Meaning that the plain meaning of the verse is that Moshe prayed with such strength and such koach that it shouldn't be ignored. And the fizeh ein makom limar limor. There's no room for the word limor, and it's meaning that Moshe cried out to tell him, right? El na refana la, the word na repeated itself. What the Zera Shimshon said, because it says el na refana, the word na repeating itself means that Moshe was trying to say with such kavanah and such strength that because by saying it so strongly, he's basically saying this is what he wants it to happen right now. And therefore, the word lemor, which is kind of an introductory statement to what the pasuk is trying to say, is unnecessary. What is the word? What does Moshe have to tell him? All it should have said is, if we look at the pasuk again, Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem el narafan Allah. It didn't have to say lemor. Lemor is a introductory statement, right? Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem would have been just enough. So that we don't need to say lemor, which is an introductory statement. And the second part of it is really, what is there for Moshe to say? Halot tfilato shel Moshe hayta your pen miyad, right? Wasn't Moshe's tefillah, the whole point of his tefillah was for Hashem to urgently heal Miriam. So therefore, if he wants his tefillah immediately answered, then there should be no for to make any statement at all. How do we understand how there's a lemor, which is an introductory statement, and then el narifan Allah, which is a statement of urgency and kind of and koach of tefillah, right? El na, we said already. So let's go repeat it just quickly. We look at the pasuk of where Moshe davens to Hashem for Miriam's healing after she received Sarat. And it says, Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem. It says, Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem lemor. And the lemor usually comes to some sort of introductory statement. And then it says, El na refan na la. And based on the Gemara in Psachim and in Zvachim, both Gemaras there say that when a word or a pasuk is repeated, then the word it's to show emphasis. So if that's the case, El na, Refan na, the word na is being repeated twice, that shows how strong and how important it was to Moshe to have the tefillot answered. If so, then why do we need to have the word lemor? Lemor is an introductory statement, which shouldn't be the case when you have something urgent. When you have something urgent to say, you don't start saying, let me introduce myself, right? You just say the statement because you're so important. Right, so we have to say that it's not that. So rather, we have to say that according to this, lachein. So we have to say that lemor, and it's whatever lemor means. That rather asking to tell Hashem, as Moshe telling Hashem is that Moshe had not really strengthened his tefillah. Meaning, what we said earlier is that at the beginning, Rashi says that when in order for someone to ensure that his Fanala means that it's something very urgent. So you can't really state something or say something if you want something to be done urgently. So rather we have to understand that we have to flip it around a little bit. And this is where the Zera Shimshon comes in. So what does it mean when he says the word na, el na refan Allah, right? If we're trying to say Moshe had not really given the right of what Rashi says, which is to give 2 or 3 words in advance of his tefillah, and therefore Moshe had not really strengthened his prayer, what we call fortifying his prayer, as Rashi says on this pasuk, Shosha divrei shnayim or shosha divrei tachanimim. Right? You have to ask a few words. You have to say something introductory before you make the request. Right? Just like any time today, when we make a request, we have to make an introduction. We butter the person up a little bit, and only then you make the request. You have to introduce it. Otherwise, the person is going to definitely say no. Therefore, the Zera Shimshon's first answer is. So he said, that the words el na, the first set of el na, that is lemor el na, is Elna, the first Elna is not part of, or not the first Elna, but Elna is not part of Inorotze Lamar Biyad B'Shazo, Kmo Refana. Rather, we have to say is that Elna is not part of the tefillah itself. Rather, Elna is the introductory statement that Moshe needed to say before he makes the request, which is what's the request? Refana Allah. So he's saying Elna, you have to read the pasuk as Lemor Elna, comma, Refan Allah. Elna is the introductory statement, which Moshe needs to say in order to kind of introduce and kind of get Hashem on his side, if you will. And then Refan is, so he says that K'mor Refana is he wants to make heal right now. In other words, na in the verse, right, is Elna is not the prayer itself. The words do not mean God now. Rather, the words are the supplication of the kind of introductory statement that Hashem is basically saying is please God. Right? We usually say is Elna Refana Allah. That's what we usually understand the word say heard. And then Refana, Vein Kan Lo Kefil, right? It says, which means please God, no Ana, as the students of Ana, which means right? So in any sense, Elna cannot mean God now, rather it can only mean please God, in which then Moshe had prayed only once, heal her now, Refan Allah. And since he did not repeat himself and did not really say something, it makes sense that he cried out to Hashem and asked him to tell him if you will heal me or not. So now what happens is he cries out. Now that we look back at what Rashi asked originally, the way Rashi mentions there that Moshe asked for proof as to whether his tefillah will be answered. Right? He says, "Please answer me." So now understand it because it says that the word Lord, in any sense, Elna cannot be God now, rather than God. In which case, Moshe had prayed. Elna is basically a separate statement, and since he didn't really repeat himself and he did not really strengthen his prayer the way he was supposed to, it makes sense that he cried out to Hashem and said, what did Rashi say? He said, please prove to me or answer my tefillah, because why? My tefillah was so short and so intact that he didn't have a chance to really fortify it, and therefore we can say that Rashi said is more. Now we understand that more to tell. It proves to us that the truth is of this explanation is elna means please. Therefore, Rashi, our original question on the Zera Shimshon's original question was, why does Rashi flip the order as to which the Pirush that usually would be is Leimor first and then Elna second? Or the first part of the Pasuk, it follows the order of the Psukim. But because we understand that Elna, Leimor, means that Moshe asked him to tell him whether or not he would nevertheless answer unfortified prayer, therefore Rashi understood this, and therefore Rashi flipped the order of the Psukim, flipped the order of his Perush, to make sure that it fits into the whole idea that the Zera Shimshon explains, which is that Leimor and Elna, we have to understand, he made no introductory statement, and therefore please God was, Elna was the first, was kind of like the, right, he didn't repeat himself, and therefore he didn't really have the opportunity to really strengthen his prayer. And since it makes sense that he cried out to Hashem, and therefore when you look at what Rashi said, he cried out to Hashem and said, Hashem, please make sure to answer my tefillah, or let me know that my tefillah is answered. Why does he start with that? Because he has to explain that otherwise, if we don't view it that way, then Elna Refanala is one tefillah, and therefore that whole tefillah, Rifna, repeated twice, would imply that he's saying with a lot of kavanah. But if you understand it the way which is Elna, comma, Refanala is the whole tefillah. Therefore, we understand that his tefillah was not necessarily the strongest tefillah, and therefore he had to say, Rashi had to flip the order of the psuki of his perush in order to explain why part one is Elna, and then Leimor second, because listen to me, Leimor, he's saying is please make sure to show me that my tefillah is answered, even though it's not as a great tefillah as it usually would be, which is a fortified tefillah, which introduced an introductory statement. So that's why the Zera Shimshon here kind of understands. He looks into it, which is which is generally a very common thing that we overlook, but the Zera Shimshon doesn't necessarily overlook it, and therefore he understands right away how did Rashi get to this idea of switching the order of his perush. He looks at the perush. Zera Shimshon comes up with saying a statement or a perush himself, saying is that the reason why Rashi did it is he flips it around in order to make sure that we understand that Rafan Allah is the entire tefillah that Moshe had for Miriam. Now Zera Shimshon goes to a second idea. So now within the same drush number 7 has 3 different perushim, and they all are in some ways connected, but they also can be standalone. The second approach that he has is that we already said that the kasher inami yesh lomar. We made another opportunity. Another explanation is the kasher Moshe my kamel more. We have to understand why did Moshe could have told Hashem that shivin al dvarai. That is, how could Moshe have told him how right? In other words, how could it be that Moshe would say, according to Rashi, which Rashi brings the Perush, the Midrash, Rashi brings the Midrash and says, Hashem, let me know if my tefillah is answered. What kind of even right? Right? Even Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the greatest person who had the connection and conversation with Hashem, is it appropriate for him to say, Hashem, let me know, by the way, let me know if my request was answered? That's not up to us to decide, and it's not up to us for Moshe to even make the statement. So the Zera Shimshon gives another interpretation, which I think is very nice and very appropriate. He says like this: Yesh Lomar remarks to the tefillah that Moshe gave, and therefore, once we understand this context, then we can understand. We can put it back into the thought process of what was going on in this moment. Yesh Makshim. There are some those who ask, He'ech tza'ak Moshe b'tfilato. How can Moshe, as it says, if we look at the Psukim again, it says, Veitzak Moshe Hashem. How can Moshe have cried out? Veitzak is a very unique word. It's not used a lot in the Chumash in general. So how could it be that he raised his voice to Hashem? Anyone raises his voice in tefillah, it's considered as if he comes from the false prophets who raise their voice. That's based on there's various Mefarshim who say that. Lefi da'atenu, kusha mikar leita. This question does not even start. Di'ita b'Torah b'hagat shulchan aruch or chaim siman kuf. If we look at the Torah and we look at the Ramah, kadesh l'midu mimenu b'nei yito, that the members of his house learn from him what they are supposed to say when they pray. Mutar, meaning what's the point here? The point is when a person raises his voice in tefillah, usually we say that you shouldn't be raising your voice in tefillah too much, because you could be considered someone who's like a nafi sheker. But the Torah, the Orach Chaim says people around you what to say and how to say it and the right proper intonations, then you're allowed to. Moshe Hutzrach Lomar Afkan. Therefore, Zera Shimshon says so too here. Moshe Hutzrach Lomar B'Kol Kadesh L'Midu Yisrael Aderech Eretz. When someone is asking for his friend for something, he needs to say 2 or 3 words of kind of introductory prayer, and only then make the request. It was appropriate in this instance because in order to teach Bnei Israel a lesson, right? Behaalotecha. We still have now we have that question. After answer that, we have another question on it. It says another aspect of Moshe Tefillah, which is its length. Right, with Elna Rafan Allah, whether we say Elna Rafan Allah was the whole tefillah or Rafan Allah was the tefillah. Now Zera Shimshon says, now that we understand the volume point, now we have to ask another question on the same thing, which is the length of the tefillah. Behaalotecha, but still we have to understand why specifically in this instance with his sister Miriam, why would it be that in this case specifically Moshe says, okay, here I'm going to teach you the point of screaming. Why would I scream, and why make such a short tefillah? So he says like this. The other prayer that he made on their behalf of Bnei Israel, they say, what was so unique about this tefillah, from what Miriam is so short, instead he kept either way 5 kind of short. Yalkut Shimoni says that why did Moshe specifically do a short tefillah here? So that way Bnei Israel wouldn't say, oh, for his sister he's willing to go all out and really keep a long tefillah, but for us, he's going to keep it short. Bishar Pami, we now can say, the Zera Shimshon continues, Bishar Pami, that in all other times that Moshe was davening for Bnei Israel, she was forced to pray in silence, as the law for prayer demands. אחד בכל, כדי שילמדו ישראל בדרך ארץ, שצריך לומר קודם התפילה 2 או 3 דברים ושלושת אחרים, שהם היו לומדים ממני נמי שמותר להתפלל בקול רם. אמנם, אתה בפעם הזאת שהוכרח להתפלל בקול רם, and he's forced to pray out loud, נחמת עניין אחר. So he says in general, Moshe didn't want to daven in out loud because he didn't want them to learn that it's okay to daven out loud. So therefore he kept all his tefillot b'lachash. But why? So therefore he said, but the Zera Shimshon picks up a very nice fine-tuned idea. He says here, he says that in every other time he was forced to pray in silence, right? Because that's the real halakha is you're supposed to daven in silence, right? And therefore, and he had in every other time, and if he had prayed one time, and every other time, and had he prayed in any other time out loud, right? Therefore, he would have learned the proper conduct of tefillah, that you have to learn that you have to introduce 2 or 3 with 2 or 3 words. And then they would have 2 or 3 words before making the request. But here, in this case, when he did pray for Miriam, he had to daven out loud. Why? Because here you have another factor. Here, so that Bnei Israel would not say that it's because he's elaborating his tefillah because of his sister. So therefore, you have is Mishum Hachi Chashav L'Lamed Aderech Eretz. He also decided to teach in the proper conduct. V'lo chashash she'yitu Yisrael lemar shemutar litpal b'kol ram v'shan yachad be'ikar tamid chashad. So basically what happens is that Zera Shimshon says is because in this case, unlike in every other case, there was no factor of his sister as being, it's his sister. So here he said, once I consider the fact that his sister, therefore the Bnei Israel were going to be more critical if he started davening for a long time. So therefore he said, once I'm already davening I'm going to keep it short so that they don't make that statement. I understand. Therefore he said, it would be, so therefore I can scream. He says, well, usually in general a moment of tefillah, it's inappropriate to pray aloud. But in this instance, because of the suspicion, it was appropriate, because of the suspicion that Bnei Israel were going to say, maybe because of the fact that it's his sister and he's going to lengthen his tefillah, therefore it's appropriate for him to be appropriate for prayer. Therefore, and keep it to a minimum, right? Therefore, and having established, Moshe used the opportunity to teach the people both, to teach them a lesson that you should be davening quietly, and also that you should be introducing the statement as much as possible, 2 or 3 words beforehand, before you make the request. Therefore, he explains why these circumstances made it appropriate for Moshe to ask Hashem. So now that we understand this whole context of Vayitzak, Zera Shimshon is basically picking up on all the words of the pasuk, and he's saying is that here in this specific case, Moshe was teaching Bnei Israel a lesson, and he said once they had a suspicion that potentially Bnei Israel were going to be upset that I was going to extend my tefillah or lengthen my tefillah because it's my sister, so I'm already keeping it short. I want to keep another lesson, which is I'm going to scream now to teach a lesson that it's not okay to scream in general here, because I want to make sure that there's no suspicion at all, and I'm going to keep it short. I'm going to keep it as short as possible so they understand that it's not, even for my sister, I'm not going to lengthen my tefillah, but I'm also going to teach them a lesson about when it's appropriate to pray out loud, which is almost never. Now you can say this. Now he even thinks like he even thinks like we might come up with some other thought process, and therefore he says, "V'im tomar dilma Yisrael lo yavinu tam chashad." Maybe Bnei Israel, which is a good question, maybe Bnei Israel will never pick up on that chashad. Maybe they won't even pick up on the whole idea that why did Moshe pray out loud, right? Maybe because of suspicions of favoritism or nepotism, right? Then and instead they would maybe think that it is okay to daven out loud, right? That's a very good question. He's saying is maybe Bnei Israel wouldn't pick up on that sensitivity or that logic, and they'd say, no, if Moshe's screaming, then we can scream too. So he says, Amar mishum hachi mitchakem Moshe, and that's why Moshe verbally says it is concerned for everyone to hear. V'amar l'kadosh baruch hu, hashiveni v'ata merapeh otam lo, klomar, ani yodea שהתפללתי אצלו כראוי, לפי שהתפללתי בקול, אבל סבור הייתי שהותר לי מפני החשד, ואם טעיתי, השיבני ואתה מרפא אותה עם לאו, שאז אחזור בכל הלחץ כדין חובת התפילה. So he says, Hashem, I know, Rashi, this is based on Rashi, quoting the Midrash, he says, this is why Moshe, Hashem, I'm demanding you to tell me whether you're going to hear my tefillah or not, because I know that you're not supposed to daven out loud. But in this case, I'm trying to teach them a lesson, and since I'm trying to teach them a lesson, I'm going to scream out loud. And in the case that it's not right, and therefore I know that maybe potentially he's not davening properly, and therefore because of the suspicion that you might have, you might be upset at me that I'm davening out loud. So he says, Hashem, let me know if my tefillah is answered or not. If my tefillah is not answered, then I'll go back to my usual standard quiet tefillah, and therefore I'll ask for the tefillah quietly, or I'll ask for the refuah quietly, and there in a way, more after refanallah. The word lemor, it means Hashem asked him to tell him whether or not to accept his prayer, right? Needs some statement before making a request. That is, Rashi first explains that Moshe taught the Jewish people to make some sort of introductory statement, Vayitzak, right? He felt it was appropriate to do it in this case because he wanted to teach them a lesson and because of the suspicion of Miriam and nepotism. Only then was it appropriate for Rashi to add that Moshe asked Hashem to tell him whether or not he would accept his prayer, right? When we know that it's usually inappropriate. So then again, the Zera Shimshon picks up on the order of the pasuk and how he answer my tefillah or not. You have to tell Hashem, these are my 2 introductions, or just Refanallah is a short tefillah. I'm keeping it short, that way they learn autism for my sister. But not only that, I'm teaching them a lesson that you're not supposed to scream out loud for dying. And also that is, I'm also giving the introductory statement a little bit, and then make the request. That's the El Na, or they found it appropriate to do it. He didn't want Bnei Israel to be suspicious that perhaps he would show El Na, so that way lay more is, Hashem, tell me if my tefillah is going to be accepted or not. Most of the time, in this parish, the Zera Shimshon, most of the time people should never have the chutzpah to do that, even with the screaming that comes is generally out of character for Moshe, and generally it's not the right way to daven. And since he screamed out of character, so the lemor has to come afterwards to say is, let me know whether I did it right or not. So Moshe was teaching us 2 lessons. One, that we should introduce our statement or introduce our tefillah, and second of all, that screaming is mostly not the appropriate approach. And finally, which is a third one to why did Moshe decide to scream out. Efshar Nami, he says a third perush, another approach as to why Moshe did actually decide that he's going to cry out. Efshar Nami, it is possible to say Milat Vayitzak, the word Vayitzak, Lo ba lomar sheit palel b'kol ram. Zera Shimshon once again changes his approach. He gives another thought process as he does. Why we would all think that Vayitzak comes from the word meaning he screamed out loud, and then he says maybe not. Maybe he says maybe he didn't pray. Rakshit palel mikirot libo. Rather he prayed from the depths of his heart. And he quotes the Zohar. The Zohar on Sefer Shemot Tzaka v'shava b'mayimit parshan. Right, we know that in the psukim around Yetziat Mitzrayim and around the slave the avdut of Bnei Israel, it says Vayitzak Yitzaku Bnei Israel v'tal shavatam Elokim. Right, so the question is, Zohar asks a very simple question: what's the difference between Tzaka and Shava? What's the difference between the two? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Shava hi betfila davka. The term Shava is more of an audible cry. That's what the way you understand it. It's something that we can actually hear, like an actual outcry of tefillah. Kidichtiv shima tefilati Hashem v'shavati hazina. Right, you can hear my shava, you can hear my outcry. Tzaka, on the other hand, is tzoek, to someone who cries inwardly. Ve'eno mer klum. Right, doesn't say anything. Right, Amar Rabbi Yehuda hilkach. Therefore, tzaka is an inward kind of expression of prayer. We've all had that, where sometimes we cry out loud and we're really, everyone can hear us crying. That's one kind of tefillah, that's one kind of expression, and one kind of real davening, which is fine and totally fine. And then he says the tzaka, which is what's the difference between tzaka and shava? So shava is that one that we come out, we cry out loud and people can hear us. And the tzaka is the one that no one hears. It's that tefillah that comes inside of us, that burns us inside, that we're davening to Hashem quietly, but it's so loud that we can hear it, right? It's inside and it's internal. It's a great idea. It's a great thought process. It says, Hilkach, Gidolat tzaka mikulam. That's why tzaka is greater than all of the other kinds of words. In fact, if you look at the word tzaka, right, is greater than shava and ancha. There's ancha, tzaka, shava, right? Those are all words that are discussed in the Zohar on this pasuk. But if you look at the tefillot, or the way the psukim are up in Shemot, when Bnei Israel are being enslaved, and when Bnei Israel are really working hard, it says Vatal Shavatam, and then it says Vayitzaku Bnei Israel, and then it says Anacha, right? The Sai, Shava, and the Tzaka, but it says Vatal Tzakatam, right? That's when it goes up, and then the next pasuk is when Hashem starts turning, the table starts to turn. So therefore, the Zohar, based on that, says Tzaka Yibalev. Right, the tzaka is the screaming, the heart. The tzaka is in the heart. Hadahu dichtiv tzak libam el Hashem, tzak libam. Therefore, the pasuk in Eicha, which is appropriate for it to be in Eicha, such a pasuk, which is that our hearts are crying, right, as opposed to being somewhere else. Eicha, the saddest lamentation, the saddest story, the saddest sefer of all of Tanakh. And said, "Vizeh yesh lamar Moshe shemitchilat tzak Moshe b'libo Hashem." Rather, first it says now this is a wonderful idea, a short idea, but what the Zera Shimshon picks up on is that the words, it said, the pasuk reads Vayitzak Moshe el Hashem limor el narafan Allah. So it says Vayitzak Moshe. The word tzaka is a quiet prayer, a silent prayer that comes from it really is from our heart, inside our heart. So therefore Moshe was crying inside first. Right? He says first he cries inside, inwardly in his heart to Hashem, and only afterwards, achar kach yitpalel. And therefore, he says, only after really crying inside his heart, really breaking down and really, opening his heart to Hashem quietly, silently, inside, without anyone hearing, and only then opening up his mouth, then we understand why the pasuk reads the way it does. So that is the first of the first Torah, which is the Torah 7. Basically, three different ways, three ways in which the Zera Shimshon understands the psukim of this situation. Elna can mean God now, in which case it is a part of the tefillah, or it can mean please God, in which case it is the introductory statement. Right? That's the first one. Moshe needed to ask Hashem to tell us whether his tefillah were answered, since he would have immediately seen whether they would have been answered. Rashi therefore means please God, by which Moshe taught it that a person must In the first, the Zera Shimshon is saying is that Rashi was trying to teach us, that Moshe was trying to teach us that we have to introduce our statement, introduce our tefillah first, and therefore, and it then follows that since Moshe had not intensified his prayer, he needed to say why, because Moshe didn't really fortify his tefillah well, because he only said El Na is part of please God. It's not the na is not a repetition na, which is what we usually understand it to be, and therefore he didn't really strengthen his tefillah correctly, and therefore Moshe had to say, Hashem, let me know if my tefillah was answered. In the second drush, he says that a person should not raise his voice in tefillah. Moshe did so when he was praying for Miriam, but Moshe raised his voice, was forced to raise his voice because he wanted to teach the people. He wanted to teach the Jewish people. He wanted to show Bnei Israel that he wasn't going to go at length. He wasn't going to elaborate his words in tefillah because it's his sister, right? He wanted to do that, so therefore he had to be out loud, and therefore Rashi starts by saying El Na, please God. He's first by saying that introductory. He makes the El Na. In this case, the Zera Shimshon said that Moshe was introducing his tefillah, and only afterwards does Rashi say Lemor, and that's where Rashi says, Hashem, let me know if my tefillah is answered, because Rashi had to do it that way, because El Na is the introductory part. Rifana, the Lemor is Moshe's request. He understood it to say, what Moshe understood, is that he said, usually I don't scream, but because I needed to show Bnei Israel a lesson, and I want them to learn about Miriam, that I'm not going to lengthen my tefillah about, in this case, especially since it's my sister. I need to show them a lesson, therefore I'm going to go out loud. And therefore, Rashi says, Lemor is after El Na, the introductory statement. Lemor, Rashi explains to be, Hashem, let me know if my tefillah is answered, because usually I know I'm not supposed to scream, but because I screamed this time, maybe my tefillah won't be answered, so you need to tell me, and if it is not going to be answered, then I'll go back to my usual quiet prayer. And the third one, Zera Shimshon quotes a Zohar, which is based on three different kinds of screaming, crying, sighing, whatever it may be. And he says that tzaka, based on a pasuk in Eicha, that the tzaka is the one that we scream from inside our hearts, but no one hears. So in this case, Moshe was screaming already. Vayitzak, he's using the word tzak that Moshe was davening already in his heart before starting the actual tefillah, which is El Na Refan Allah, and therefore Vayitzak comes to show that Moshe, before he even opened his mouth, he was already crying inside, asking for his tefillah. So therefore, the tzaka is the one that we usually know that tzaka is the one that is the actual tefillah. That tzaka is so piercing that even though we haven't opened our mouth, our heart is screaming for to be answered. So as soon as he opens his mouth I believe it's, I think in Mordecai, and the story of Esther and Mordecai, I believe Mordecai, so therefore, he makes a scream, and we've screamed so many times in our heart, we want it so badly, that Hashem hears that tefillah, and the tefillah actually gets turned around and answered. All right.
Class, Mr. Hashem, it's only get better, the Wi-Fi will get fixed, and everything will...
Zera Hashem. Bezrat Hashem.
Class.
Bezrat Hashem. I could actually make the 10 o'clock Marif. Sweet.
Colors.